Good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, and very pleased to be the host for a very special conversation with Francisco Tudela, the former first Vice President of the nation of Peru. He is also its former Foreign Minister and its UN Ambassador, a man, in other words, of accomplishment, particularly in the public policy arena, both domestically in Peru and internationally. And it's a great pleasure to say that he has been a partner of ours in trying to establish and maximize the utility of a new project at the Center for Security Policy. We're calling it the Hemispheric Security Project. And its purpose is basically to try to raise awareness about what is happening in the hemisphere that has very profound implications for both the security of friends of this country, like Peru, historically, and for others in the region of Latin America, as well as for us here in the United States. I'm very pleased to say that Francisco Tudela is the author of a new white paper, which we published 2 weeks ago, I believe, here at the Center for Security Policy, entitled "The New Peruvian Government's Threat to the Western Hemisphere." It's a relatively short but very impactful analysis of what has happened basically in the 6 or 7 months now since Pedro Castillo, the new president of Peru, a communist, came to power, and what he has done both within the government itself and to the society more generally, and most importantly, really, what it has set in train, building on other previous communist takeovers of various countries in the hemisphere, and what it will portend. Again, both for the people of Peru, the people of the region, and for the rest of us. Francisco Tudela, it is an honor to have you with us, sir, here on our GETTR live stream on the 14th of January, 2022. And I so appreciate your work on this paper, your insights in now several webinars and other short videos that we've done under the banner of the Center for Security Policy's Hemispheric Security Project. And we look forward to a conversation today about the main findings of your white paper and its most important takeaways. Welcome, sir.
It's a very important subject, the one we have to tackle now. Because in fact, as you know, in July, Pedro Castillo, who is the head of Peru Libre, a communist party, took office in Peru, and they've been acting very quickly in the last months, taking control of the whole state. They won the election through a combination of corruption scandals with the past administrations, of COVID-19 frustration, and electoral fraud that has just today been discarded by the national prosecutor. And that is due because after an initial success, this communist government began a confrontation with the parliament, and the parliament has passed a law by which they can't make the main point of the program, that is a constituent assembly, to change the constitution, to make Peru a socialist country, and at the same time to remain in power forever, as is the case of the socialist parties in Venezuela and in Bolivia and in Nicaragua. So in this first clash with Congress, they've lost the possibility of making the referendum. They will try to force that again in the near future, but they have been able to take control of the intelligence services, of the National Intelligence Service, the intelligence services of the armed forces and the police, the national prosecutor office. They are constructing the party Peru Libre, that is a communist, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, as they say, party. They are constructing the party inside the Peruvian state, giving its members clue posts in the administration in all levels, from the highest level to the lower level. And even if the press and the people say that those persons are not qualified for office, it doesn't matter. They are members of the party, and even if they are completely ignorant, they will obey blindly what the party says to them. At the same time,
dispensed with the case, and I gather that that's because of this takeover that you've just described by the national government. Is that right?
The takeover, the head of the Fiscalía de la Nación, that is the national prosecuting institution, has taken a leave, but she had to investigate Pedro Castillo because of serious and proven allegations of corruption. And she opened the investigation and then closed it, saying that the president cannot be investigated until the end of his mandate. That is not true. The Constitution establishes that the president cannot be accused, but he can be investigated. And several administrations before this one have been investigated, been in office. So this is a big shift in power. And to have the police, the armed forces submitted to this Marxist government, and at the same time the intelligence services headed by people they have nominated, all the regional prefects and sub-prefects in Peru, because we have a system like the French, are now in the hands of pro-Shining Path members of FUDEP or Movadef that are facades of the Shining Path. So militarily, we won against the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru terrorist movements, but now politically they are winning. At the same time, we have a huge shift in foreign policy. We are not pro-Western anymore. This government has aligned itself with China, with communist China, with Russia, that is now in a very difficult negotiation, diplomatic negotiation about Ukraine with the US, with Iran, that has presence in Latin America. Yesterday, Díaz-Canel has had an interview with a high-level Iranian in Cuba, a functionary that was one of the terrorists that blew the AMIA in Buenos Aires, the Jewish cooperative. So they are running amok all over the continent. Yeah. And they are promoting an ethnic class warfare that is a strategy of conflict by which they deny the Republic in Peru. They said 200 years, because this year is the bicentenary of the Republic, that's 200 years of exploiters, of thieves, of whatever, and now we are beginning anew, where our ancestors, the Incas, left things. Yeah. So that's nonsense. It's propaganda, but it's very dangerous. And then, as Peru has a geostrategic, a very privileged geostrategic position in the Western hemisphere, because it is in the Pacific coast, in the parallels of Samoa, the Solomon Islands, the south of Indonesia, the north of Australia, etc., etc. The Chinese are very active. 170 corporations are in Peru. They control, in fact, all big mining, especially copper and iron, and they have gotten into the water business, banking business, insurance. So China is in a certain way developing a kind of neo-imperialist policy in Peru. Peru signed.
Let me interrupt you just to make one
Yes.
quick point, if I may, because I think that several of these dots warrant connecting. You described the sort of program of Castillo and his government as a radical, well, communist program inside the country. And you've also made the point that they are actively working with communist powers and certainly nations aligned with the communist Chinese, for example, in terms of the external policies of the country. When you put these two parts of the program together, is it safe to say that the agenda is, well, to use Barack Obama's famous phrase, the fundamental transformation of Peru from a free market economic system, albeit with some socialist trappings, and one aligned with the West, into a nation that will reliably follow the communist program, both in terms of its own society and economy and political system, and that will be working with the Chinese communists and their friends and proxies, including through something called the Forum of Sao Paulo, that would make it very much at odds with, hostile to, in fact, the United States of America?
You're right, Frank. That has already happened.
Wow.
We are already in the net of the Forum of Sao Paulo, that is 124 communist parties, and the CEO of those 124 communist parties is Cuba, the Communist Party of Cuba, and this huge network has taken power in Mexico, in Nicaragua, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, and poses the danger of converting the Western Hemisphere, all of the Americas from the Rio Grande to the Magallanes Strait, into a huge platform against the West, against the United States. The anti-Americanism of all these governments is outspoken.
Yes.
The anti-Western attitudes of all these governments is also outspoken. And at the same time, the establishment, by example, in the case of Chinese interests in Peru, they are building a huge port 80 kilometers north of Lima. It's a huge investment. It's $1,500 billion to make a huge port of more than 42 hectares with a reinforced concrete tunnel that connects to the Pan American Highway of more than 1 mile long, with deposits and an internal route and a mole of more than 400 meters in form of L, 27 meters wide, and a draft of 17 meters. That is for the Super Panamax E3 ships.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's feasible to be used as a center of logistic support, let's say, for a carrier strike force of China in the future. So we have to see the strategic position of Peru. And it's the same with Mexico, and it's the same with Chile. If all these countries fall one after another into the orbit of the Forum of Sao Paulo, that is the second circle. The first circle is the local communist parties. The second circle is the Forum of Santiago. And the third circle is the real shareholders of the company. And those are the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians. So let's be frank. What is happening is that we are confronting the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, but fought by forces that are fighting the West.
Right. So when you describe it that way, it becomes pretty obvious that, as I said earlier, the people of the region and our own people are going to have profound stakes, shall we say, in what transpires here. How would you characterize, for example, the specific implications for Americans of the kinds of changes in policy and the thrust of the alignment, really, of not only your country, but perhaps a little later this year, building on what happened at the end of last year with the election of a communist to the presidency of Chile, in Colombia and Brazil as well. What would you say to the American people about what's on the line for us?
Well, the first thing I would say to the American people is that if in May 29, the left wins the general elections in Colombia, and in October the 2nd, the left wins the general elections in Brazil, the continent will be close to the US because these governments will structure legislation and business links with the Chinese, the Russians, between them, the Latin American governments, in such a way that Americans will not be able to compete. So economically, the continent will become more and more closed to American investments. And that's a big danger. It's a big danger for economic freedom. At the same time, militarily.
When you say investments, you mean as well, trade as opportunities, I assume.
Investments, everything. Right? Because we might drift to protectionist policies, etc., designed to benefit some countries and not other countries. Now we are, in a certain way, under a free trade agreement with the US. But that could change in the future if the balance of power changes in the whole region.
Yes.
That is why it's crucial. The October election in Brazil is crucial because Brazil is a powerhouse and a big power in Latin America. And if Brazil slides to, let's say, the dark side, to use a Star Wars analogy, yes, then the whole continent becomes a socialist continent. And that will have, in Peru, the economic impact, we are already feeling it. Inflation is over 7%. Unemployment is immense. The shutdown of businesses that are broke are by the hundreds of thousands in the country. And if that begins to happen in the whole continent, what you will have is first that the continent will become a place where these great international powers may be able to position themselves even militarily. As yesterday we have known that in the case of Venezuela, Russia will increase its military advisors. They've been selling weapons, and there are Russian advisors in Venezuela since 1999, since Chavez got to power. But now they are going to increase the number of advisors and sell more sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles. They have sold to Venezuela very sophisticated planes, And the same thing might happen all around the continent. So it can become a toxic continent for the West, as has.
Mr. Vice President, about another toxic quality, and that is the drug trafficking business. What is the current status of that in Peru at the moment, as well as what's likely to transpire as a result of the changes in government and policy?
It's very difficult to know what will happen. But of course, there is a strong interaction between Evo Morales and the Bolivian government under President Arce and the government of Pedro Castillo. As you know, Bolivia many years ago expelled the US ambassador, expelled the DEA, expelled USAID, and has an economy that is geared to protect drug production, the copper fields, and the production of cocaine. Peru is
itself is a narco trafficking operation.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, Peru is the second world producer of cocaine. According to the White House, we have exported last year 810 tons of refined cocaine. And there's strong links with Bolivia, and some of the members of the party in power have been very outspoken, saying that Peru must expel the DEA and not work with the US against the drug trafficking in Peru. And of course, that means only one thing: funding. Funding for the extreme left parties that comes from the drug business. And this,
I would argue, not just the party apparatus itself, which brings us to the damage that that agenda has done in other parts of the hemisphere to the economy most immediately, as communist, infrastructure and principles are applied. But it also, I think is fair to say, is something that will contribute materially to the determination of people subjected to all of this to flee the country rather than stay. You've had a lot of experience, of course, in Peru with what's taken place as a result of the communist takeover and despoiling of Venezuela. What is your projection as to what that would mean for us in the United States, sir, if this would be happening in Peru?
It would be terrible, because in Peru we have 1 million Venezuelans. They are desperate because they jumped from the frying pan to the fire.
Right.
And now they don't know where to go and how to get out of Peru. And of course, if the whole continent and if Peru fails economically in a dramatic way, people will vote with their feet.
Yeah.
They will go to the free countries in the world, and the most attractive free country in the world is the United States. So let's be realistic. That's the first option for all Latin Americans. That's the first option. And one has to understand that when people are in a straitjacket, in an economic straitjacket, well, they try to find a better future somewhere else. In Peru now, we have a crisis that is very similar to the ones the Venezuelans had more than 10 or 15 years ago, and that is that you cannot get a passport anymore. The argument of the authorities is that they don't have passports in stock, and so they cannot issue passports because they don't have them. Hugo Chavez did exactly the same thing. All these Venezuelan migrants have had to leave the country with documents of identity national documents of identity or with driving licenses because they couldn't get a passport. And it's a way to, at the same time, instill fear in the people and force them to desperate measures. So in fact, migration is in the future. And if the whole continent falls into these policies and these governments, then Latin America will have more than a decade or more of catastrophic economic and social consequences.
Yes.
So I really do think that what you say, Frank, is true. And it's not something that will happen in the future. It's something that has already begun 6 months ago.
In your country, of course, it was happening in others in the region and in the Caribbean, in Cuba, for example, as well. But it's now taking over a critically important, strategically located and endowed nation of Peru, and that has clearly been a new and important impetus behind the takeover of the rest of the hemisphere, starting with Chile now at the end of last year. We're about at the end of our time with you, Mr. Vice President, and I'm so grateful to you for taking the time. I did want to just invite you to sort of give us some parting thoughts about the kinds of points that you've made in your white paper. Again, the new Peruvian government's threat to the Western Hemisphere is its title, that both those in Peru and those here in the United States should be doing in the face of the very serious and, it seems, intensifying dangers associated with what's happened so far in the Castillo regime.
Well, Frank, I think it's a very difficult moment. You cannot have half measures to confront this. To think that things will solve by themselves or stabilize by themselves is not realistic. They are progressing very rapidly, and there are political parties that are fighting against communism in parliament, in Peru, everywhere, in Chile, in Brazil, and civil society is realizing the grave danger in which they find themselves. And I think that it is very important that the reality of what is happening in Latin America should be known in the US, because during two administrations, the George Bush and the Obama administrations, for 16 years, the US ignored Latin America. They believed in a kind of automatic pilot. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Common communist fell with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so things will go well in Latin America, and we don't have to be watchful, and we don't have to take any responsibility vis-a-vis Latin American society.
Let alone engage to try to help.
Well, the fact is that now we are the battlefield of a new Cold War, as is Ukraine. But it's nearer to the US. Venezuela, to put an example, is the Ukraine of the Americas. For all the military contentions are in this moment taking place. Peru has a huge geopolitical projection into the continent. If you see a map of Latin America, you will see that Peru, that is a big country, it's the size of California, Texas, and Florida together and more, has five boundaries with all the main countries of Latin America. And it's the hub by which China intends to get into Latin America, and the Chinese have said so at the APEC meetings. So in fact, we are facing realities.
So just to close, if you had one prescription for your own country's people and one prescription for ours, what would it be?
Well, in Peru, we have to fight inside democratic rules. So we have a legal fight against this government, and at the same time, you have several movements of public opinion and civil society that are in the streets. That needs an incentive. That needs an incentive because, as happened in Serbia with Milosevic, and as happened with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or with the Maidan Square and the fall of Yanukovych, civil society plays a very important role with the democratic institutions, in this case, the parliaments of Latin America. And I think that the US must seek the ways, not only, I don't say the US government that seems very aloof from all of this and now, but the different think tanks and different groups of interest in the US must realize that they must help the democratic forces in Latin America, and they must encourage those forces. And they must understand that the political campaign against Bolsonaro in Brazil in October this year will be an international campaign. The electoral impact of CNN, I would say that sometimes exceeds the national press of these countries. Not only of CNN, of the Washington Post, of the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, etc., and Russia Today.
All of which are very much aligned with the left.
That's right. Al Jazeera, etc., etc. They were the ones who sank Cast in Chile, because Cast had won in the first round, and then they began this huge wave of international propaganda saying the ultra-rightist Cast, etc., son of an officer of the German army. Well, who is your father doesn't determine who you are.
That's right.
And there are
it's often said that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children, but in this case, that was unfair and contributed, as you say, to the outcome of the communists taking power in Chile.
Came from the US, came from Europe.
Right.
The main line of attack, it didn't come from Chile itself. But so it showed
the friends of communism in Europe. And I think your larger point, if I may say, is that we have two countries in Latin America that are going to be critically important to determining the future trajectory of the hemisphere, Colombia and Brazil, both of which are up for grabs in this year. And you can bet that the kinds of pressures, the kinds of powers, the kinds of external forces especially, that have operated in the past year dramatically in two other important countries, yours, Mr. Tudela, and that of Chile, will be full flower on display in this coming year. I second strongly what you have called for in terms of engagement on the part of public policy organizations like our Center for Security Policy, and much more importantly, of course, our Congress and our government to align themselves with the forces of freedom in this region, as it will be lost, I fear, to those south of our border, and that will have very profound implications, as you've said, for those north of it. We'll leave it at that, sir. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for this important product, which people can find at securefreedom.org. Francisco Tudela's white paper on the new Peruvian government's threat to the Western Hemisphere. I urge you to read it and take it to heart and join us in acting on it. Thank you very much, Mr. Tudela, and thank you to all of you who have listened. As I'm fond of saying, go forth and multiply. Thank you, sir.